Welcome to episode 232. Some really cool updates. So, first, this is one of the first live streamed episodes in a very long time on Backpacking America. And this is actually simultaneously being streamed on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. So, that's pretty cool. We're reaching multiple platforms at once. What I want to say first is I want to thank everyone for tuning into this very special episode. I know it's a little late. I know it's after June 6th, 19 Jesus Christ. June 6th. But today someone just followed my thing. That's cool. Thank you, Devin Abbott. That's cool. Um that was a very loud noise. But anyway, thank you. Whoa, I gotta turn that off. Can I what do I Okay, there we go. Um so anyway, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this episode. I wanted to commemorate June 6th, 1944, which holds a very uh, special day in my heart. Honestly, my grandfather was a participant in Operation Overlord, but he came in about a week after the initial invasion. So he was a clerk in the United States Army, and he was I gotta fix this. I don't know why that keeps going off. He was a clerk in the United States Army, and he was always about like a mile away from the fighting. And I thought it was like really cool that he had so many stories, even though he said he never fired a shot or was engaged in direct combat. He was a um, he still had a lot of stories, and he saw a lot of traumatic events. Not that that's cool, but I mean, he saw a lot of traumatic events. He saw a lot of um, life-changing lessons. Really, he told a lot of stories to me when I was a young boy. It stuck with me for the rest of my life, which I'm going to share with you all today. And I also wanted to reflect on the importance of the day and why it should be important for everyone that's listening right now. Um, I believe it's an important day for everyone because when you look back at like that time period, no one really knew everything. There was no televised war. There was no live streaming from the front line so you can get an understanding of what's going on. There was no there was no understanding of anything. It was just a propagandized version. And he would always, my nana would always tell me, uh, he was very idealistic about the war and very had these preconceived notions. And then he got there, and it completely changed. And I know a lot of veterans have said that even into it, veterans of the global war on terror, they had the same idealistic image when they went in. They're gonna go get revenge and go get Osama, and then they saw the reality of the conflict in front of them. Um, I will say that my no, and I guess, I would say this in myself too. We'd both agree that, so many young men sacrificed their lives to defend the world from tyranny and to free Europe from the clutches of Nazism. And it was it's especially important because when you look at it from the perspective of like what the average American goes through today and our as young people. Because I often think, I'm like, wow, when I was 19, 20, 21, even today, to some extent, I think of like, okay, well, if I was in, the 1930s or the 40s, I'd probably be fighting in a Japanese jungle or, uh, a European battlefield somewhere. So, it puts things in perspective sometimes where it's like, life isn't as bad as you think it is. Because, listening to some of his stories and then listening to the stories of other veterans, um, really puts in perspective like the horrors of war and how fortunate we are not to deal with the problems that my grandfather had to go through in 1944. Um, we're not getting shelled, we're not getting shot at with machine guns, we're not getting um, any of that really. I mean, the global war on terror is over. There hasn't been a draft since Vietnam. Joining the military, there's so many different departments and places you can get tucked away and where you won't get exposed to conflict. Whereas, in the Second World War, you were. My grandfather was a clerk and, he was getting shelled every night. He'd tell me stories about, the German bombers flying overhead and how the ground was like shaking under him and how he couldn't, sleep for days and it was dark out, and these these planes with just waves and waves and waves for days on end, and he wasn't able to sleep. He would tell me stories of, his friends, getting shot down in bombing raids and all this other stuff. Because he was Army Air Corps, so that was the predecessor to the Air Force, but he was a clerk. So he was like ground personnel. Um, so he was one of the guys with the M1 carbine, not the M1 Garand. So he was like rear guard troops. And he would just do paperwork. And he was still like, he was only a mile away from the conflict. Because if you're support personnel, you know, you couldn't be 20, 30 miles away from the conflict. You had to be like literally right behind the guys. So that way, because, technology wasn't as advanced, you couldn't communicate. The farther away you were, the harder it was. Even though we did have radio and we did have, telegrams and stuff, it wasn't as good as it was in the 60s or the 70s. So he had to do stuff like that. And, it took a profound effect on him to where, um, he he was definitely he told me a lot more than he told my mom. That's for sure. I think the older you get, the more you want to impart your legacy on the next generation. So I think he kind of came to terms with the fact like, oh, I need to tell this kid, what's good. Um, he told me about, how his friends they would drown in rivers and stuff, just being doofuses, and he would tell me story. I mean, it was also like he'd tell me stories about, marching through France because he wasn't just like stuck in France. He, marched through France following a unit, and he marched ended his last tour was in Metz, Germany. His last part of his service in the European theater, and he would tell me about France a lot because his father was a French immigrant and his mother was a French immigrant, and he ended up in his father's hometown of Strasbourg and or Stroudsburg, depending on how you say it and who, whether you're French or German. But he was there, and there was a big chapel, and um he was looking at this chapel, and he's like, "Oh my God, it's a miracle that the bombs, didn't touch anything. Only like a small part of the chapel was damaged by the bombing, but for the most part, it was intact." And he was impressed by this. So he gets home from the war and he tells his father about this. He says, "Oh, Pop, the chapel is fine. It just had some of the stained glass was damaged in the bombing and stuff." To my nonno, he was like, "Pretty good. It's alive. It's there." Um, and then his father started breaking down crying, and he was like, "Oh, Pop, what's wrong?" Like, and turns out, this chapel was very important to his father because across the street from that chapel, he would sit in France back then, especially, you could drink at any age. And he was like, "Oh yeah, his father said I was 12 years old and every morning I'd have a small glass of wine and I would, sit across from the chapel and drink while I looked at the stained glass." And then it hit my nonno and he was like, "Oh my God, it's like the horrors of war." It's um even though his father wasn't, lived in America at that point and hasn't been in France in decades, it still was very personal because, and the worst part is that he couldn't see it, I guess, because it's like, oh, like I have to imagine this in my head. It's not even like it's presented in front of me. So overall, it was a horrible time period. Um, he would even tell me stories though. Sometimes he would tell me funny stories where it would be a they were watching a German column surrender, and I think this was in Germany, and the capturing officer, the army captain or sergeant or whatever, he told the the marching surrendering soldiers to drop their trousers and get rid of their belts, and then all their trousers just fell to the floor, and then made them march with their pants around their ankles to the prisoner of war camp. And that was a pretty funny story. I like that one a lot. Um, but he was a great man, and he definitely taught me a lot and inspired a lot of love of history for me, um, and gave me that passion for it of all types of history, really. Um, and that's why this day is really important because it's like I have a direct lineage to it, but also he made me appreciate the finer aspects of all history, especially Normandy history, and I want to pull up, excuse my typing, but I'm gonna pull up Dwight D. Eisenhower's speech before um Operation Overlord. It was a really impressive speech, and I feel like it wasn't. You don't really get stuff like this anymore. You really don't. So I'm gonna read you the full thing, and it says, so from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Uh, let's see here. Hold on, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Copy the letter below. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hope and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 to 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle man to man. Our air defense has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. And that was the last communication before thousands of soldiers, young men, aged 17 to 21, ran across the beaches of Normandy. It was Omaha Beach, Juno Beach, Utah Beach, Gold Beach, and Sword Beach. And there was my grandfather was in Omaha Beach. So the two American beaches were Omaha Beach and I believe, oh, that's really bad. That's really bad. But I know that Juno Sword and uh one of the other ones was Canadian and British, and then the Americans took Omaha and another beach, and that's really bad. So I do apologize for that. Shows how rusty I am in World War II history. But nevertheless, the English, the Canadians, Polish resistance fighters that were trained in Britain, French resistance fighters that were trained in Britain, Americans, Canadians, English, probably said them already, all got in these boats and they went forward and they dropped when the boats dropped their ramps, they faced machine gun fire from all the German pillboxes and bunkers on the hills that they had to climb up to get. So for those of you that don't know about Normandy, it was just flat beach, and then it was just like basically a 90-degree angle of like a 100-foot hill with pillboxes and mortars and machine guns all around it. And these guys had to run across open beach with no cover, try and get there. And it was a bloody affair. 4,000 Americans died in Omaha Beach. It was one of the worst beaches for casualty rates among Allied forces, and it was also the heaviest beach defended. The U.S. Army Rangers really pushed forward and did an absolute number on the pillboxes, but they lost so many people. So I wanted to say fantastic job, but I mean yes, fantastic job. They were successful, but horrible, horrible losses. It's really a David and Goliath situation. I'll put it like that. It was impressive and remarkable, and then very sad. It's very somber talking about such an occasion, really. It was a desperate battle to free Europe from Nazi tyranny, and when the guys would get over the hills, they were like, "Oh, thank God!" And then then it was just clearing trenches and such. Because once they got over the hill, that was the hardest part of the battle, was just getting over the hill. Then it was just breaking through the thick hedgerows, which wasn't a cakewalk, but it was much better than having to run across an open beat with machine gun fire and mortar fire raining down on you. Fun fact about that, uh, the D-Day landings was It was actually supposed to occur on June, I believe, 4th or 5th. But what happened was the tide was so low that, oh no, the tide was so high that the landing craft wouldn't be able to actually land properly um at the designated area. So it had to be just low enough where the ships didn't scrape the sand, but there was enough like room where they could at least be waist high or chest high and wade it onto the beach. So it was a lot of weather that was played into it. So originally it was like June 4th or 5th, and then they had to run across that beach in an absolute bravery because there was actually on my Instagram it's Backpacking America, my Instagram. I posted um a video clip of a Normandy veteran, and he was describing what happened when you dropped the ramp of your landing craft, and it was horrible. I mean, as soon as you did that, what the Germans would do is they would just wait for them to drop the door, and they would just start opening up their machine gun and rifle fire into each boat's ramp. So whoever was in the front most likely was gonna die, and a lot of guys would just jump over the sides of the boat. A lot of men drowned. A lot of them died 2 or 3 feet from their landing craft, and it just bled out into the ocean. And for days, maybe even a week after, the beach and the water was filled with blood. The sand was soaked with blood. And about a week later is when my grandfather came in. So he must have seen all that. He may have told me that story or stories about that, but he didn't. He said that the beach was all cleaned up when he was there, but who really knows? I'm gonna choose to believe his side of the story, but um, 'cause it's just a nicer story, and I really hope he didn't see that. But what he did say is when he was there about a week later, the beach was built up. It had like ramps and cranes and factories and all these different mechanisms to support incoming troops and get them set up and push them forward over the beach. Because at that point, it was just once the beachhead was secure and the ports were secured, it was just a matter of um funneling supplies and equipment just over that beach consistently nonstop. Um, then there was the he told me another story. Oh yeah, so he gets on he's one of the guys, one of the first waves of reinforcement troops and rear guard troops to keep communications and everything moving. So he's there. He gets up on the beach and he's climbing up um the the mountain with all these other guys. Because it wasn't that built up, but it was still a bitch of a walk. I mean, yeah, you're hiking with like 20, 30 pounds of gear up like a 90-degree hill that just had craters and blood and guts spilled over the last like few days. So he gets up there, he sees a foxhole, he falls backwards into it, undoes his kit, and he's like, "Oh, thank God." And then he turns over to his right or his left, and he sees his left, and he sees his friend Smiley, and he's like, "No way, what are you doing here?" And his friend Smiley, they were friends in Brooklyn, and because that's where my nana was from. He's from Brooklyn, and his friend Smiley was from Brooklyn. And they were so excited to see each other. They stuck with each other the rest of the war, just because they haven't seen anyone they noticed it ever, and they were surprised they didn't see each other on the ships or anything. So they spent a majority of the war, or at least the rest of the war, together. And after the war, he ended up going missing, and he was looking for his daughter, and she went missing in the woods with some guy, and then he tried to find her, and he disappeared. So no one really knows what happened to him. But that's just a little aside from the greater picture of the day. The French are eternally grateful for the to the Allied powers that liberated the country on June 6th, and they have when you go to Normandy, there's a variety of memorials and statues and commemorative plaques and artifacts and museums all along the beach. And yes, there are beachgoers that go there and that still use the beach. Of course, there is controversy over that where it's like, oh, they shouldn't use the beach. This is solemn ground. And then there's other sides of it where it's like, well, what would you rather it be? Just a dead place because one event took it over? Or would you rather be filled with life again with little children running around and you know, people in their early 20s and mid 20s drinking beers and having a great time, just partying on the beach. I mean, I think, for the spirits that linger around there, and trust me, I get the other side of it too, where it's like it should be hallowed ground. At first, I'd be a little tight if I saw that, but then it's like, all right, like there are, you know, spiritual entities that are still there because it was a tragic end many of those people faced. Um, that are still in that area, and I think they'd smile if they saw a bunch of people their age when they died now coming together and partying and drinking on the same beach where they met a tragic death, where instead of hanging out with other people their age, they were sent to kill them or save them from horrible wounds. I think there's a strange poetry in that, and I think that, and I understand, the point of view too, where it would be disrespectful, but I mean, if I was a French citizen or an American tourist on Normandy and I was just relaxing on the beach, I mean, it would be more somber, but I would still have a good time. It would just be more of a like a respectful party. You know what I mean? Just mind where you are, because it is a gravesite for many people. Um, and then, as you move through, I mean, the Belgians very grateful for that invasion. The Danish very grateful for that invasion. Um, all of Europe, all of Western Europe, very grateful for it. Um, I know that, and the reason that that front was created was because Stalin asked for second front in or late 1941, early 1942 to alleviate pressure from the Germans. And there was a lot of planning that went into that operation. It was a years long planning. After Dunkirk in 1940, the English were planning, at least making rough sketches for how to invade and reclaim mainland Europe from the Nazis. The reason why it didn't happen sooner is because we didn't have the material, we didn't have the landing craft, we didn't have our army was still being rebuilt in 1942 because we were attacked in very late 1941. It was December 1941. The next month was 1942. So we were just waking up. We were like, what the hell? That's actually my grandfather was drafted in spring of 1942 and trained at what was it? Brookhaven National Labs, which used to be Camp Upton. Used to be Camp Upton. So, he went from Brooklyn to Long Island, New York, where I'm recording out of. He trained at Camp Upton, which is now the Brookhaven Labs, and then he was shipped out to Ireland and, England and all these other places in the Allied countries to get experience, and then he was sent over to Normandy. What was interesting about his time in Ireland too is that he was like, "Yeah, we thought the Germans were gonna invade Ireland, so we had to burn all these documents and get the hell out of the base camp and relocate." And I was like, "Oh, that's kind of weird." But like, so I don't know what that was about. I want to do more research into that story to see like what the information was. But they were just told, burn everything. We're heading out of here," and that's what they did. Um, it must have been in 1943 or something that happened, but he was in Ireland, and then he went to France, and then he ended up in Metz, Germany, towards the end of the war, which is like in the middle of Western Germany somewhere, or in the southern area, honestly. And yeah, so I mean, honestly, the that campaign, that D-Day campaign, was really it was an important day and an important moment in history because that was when the Nazis knew that when the Atlantic War, when the Atlantic Wall is what they called it, was defeated and destroyed, and Americans were able to cross over and British were able to cross over that that hill, the war was lost because there's no way you're able to make a successful landing like that without the logistical support. The Germans knew how difficult it would be because the Germans wanted to invade England, but they understood that it would be so costly to do that that what they decided to do, what the Germans decided to do is just bomb England into submission, and when they are close to surrender or they are so incapacitated, then they're going to send in their land forces and their tanks to invade the island of the United Kingdom, but only after they were bombed into submission because they knew they didn't have the manpower because they were already stretched too thin. They took over most of Europe. They didn't have enough navy to compete with the Royal Navy. and to gain supremacy over the English Channel, especially in the air too, because the RAF was during the Battle of London when they were dropping bombs in 1940, 1941 over London. They weren't able to break the English spirit or break the Royal Air Force. So the English repelled that, and the whole operation I'm talking about is Operation Sea Lion, where the Germans would would invade the United Kingdom, but it never happened because the Battle of London was a British victory. As the whole point of the Battle of London was to bomb London and bomb England into submission and destroy their morale to the point where they can't fight. There were mutinies. The Air Force was crippled, the Navy was crippled, and then it opened them up, right? So that failed. So the Germans were like, if the Allies do this, if they have the balls to do what we don't have the balls to do, it's over. It is absolutely over because no one would be stupid enough to invade France without the proper logistical or material support. And then lo and behold, it happened. And that's when the German high command knew it was on the defensive, especially because they were losing in the east against the Russians around that time. Around that time, the Russians were gaining massive swaths of territory, were pushing towards Poland, and were about to liberate, the eastern Polish villages. And this was around the time when concentration camps were starting to get discovered. And originally, the Allied powers, they didn't really believe that there were concentration camps. They're like, all right, like maybe this is just like a communist plot or something to like feign sympathy towards us. So we like, I don't know, join an alliance or whatever. But because they were the Soviets were technically a part of the Allied powers, but it was they were a communist country, so it was a little awkward for FDR and Churchill, who especially was an anti-communist. Um, but the Soviets ended up saying, "Oh, look at this," and then as the Americans advanced into the west of Germany, they started liberating concentration camps and they started seeing the horrors of it. So then it ended up being confirmed like, oh, there are concentration camps in Germany. So overall, the the Allied invasion of France and the Soviet push east together, without those two events, the war would have been bloodier, crueler, more people would have died in the Holocaust. It would have been far worse fighting if either the Soviets had to push all the way to France or the Allies had to push all the way to Moscow. It would have been a terrible, terrible tragedy. But that's basically, I just want to say, a major thank you to, and I know most of them are no longer here with us, unfortunately. A major thank you to uh, our our veterans that served in World War II and especially the Normandy campaign. But major thank you. And to celebrate that, on a happy note, this is some wine that a someone from my old job at LA News Radio gave me. It's Behringer Brothers Bourbon Barrel Aged Red Wine Blend. I'm gonna have a little bit of it because I'm not like a crazy drinker, but I would like to partake in some alcohol consumption right now. If I can open this. I hope I didn't break it. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, that smells like red wine. I really like bourbon though. Um, so I want to just have a little bit of this. This is a thank you. And I also want to have it in commemoration to a friend of mine. His name was David Levenstein. He used to be one of my old coworkers, and he became a friend of mine. Towards the end of his life. Um, yeah. David Levenstein was a good dude. He worked at LI News with me. He was the general manager of the station, and he was really creative, really cool dude. So this one's to I know it's really off topic, but it's just been on my mind. And I definitely wanted to say something. So this one's to our veterans that fought in the Normandy campaign and to a dear friend of mine, David, who's no longer with us. So yeah, let's see how this tastes. Wow, that is actually really good. I didn't it's this wine, what's cool about it, um, is that it's aged in whiskey barrel or bourbon barrels. Yeah, bourbon barrel aged. So it definitely has like a little bit of a bourbon burn, if you will. I'd say I like it. It's smooth. It tastes nice. A coworker has a show at LI News Radio, Tony Zambri. he hooked me up with this. So Tony, thank you for this wine. It's really good. For all of my viewers right now, listeners, subscribers, wherever you are, um, I will be getting a solid set time where I'm going to be live streaming, and I'd love to have everyone, comment, reach out, text me, DM me, whatever. Uh, your thoughts, feelings on the show. And once again, I am going to reiterate that, I am moving away from the political and news end of the show. I want to focus more on the cultural aspect and the history aspect of the show, just because I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot when it comes to my political views. And I have so much historical knowledge and stories that I want to impart. And I really want to kind of bring it back to the brand image because I get a little carried away sometimes. So I'm going to do my best to fit in with the brand image. I do have a remote job now, so I'm able to do this a lot more, which is really cool. My time at LI News Radio was great. I just needed to move on to a different career path and you know make some other moves, especially for my business. So that's what we're kind of doing right now. We're on that self improvement way. But anyway, um, thank you to everyone that listened today. I hope you all took away something from the stories I told. Um, and to you know especially the experiences of these veterans and the history of it in general. So much love and respect to our World War II veterans that are no longer with us. My nunno who's no longer with us, he was one of the bigger reasons why I'm even into history in the first place. He was a major inspiration. So I guess the second sip is to you. Thank you, nunno. um and our World War II veterans, um, and our veterans of today as well that can relate to some of the stories and the experiences that I talked about earlier. Um, yeah.